2014, did you download a device that was purported to be owned by Wendy Adelson?
Yes.
All right, what type of device was that?
It was an Apple iPhone 4.
What type of downloading do you do?
The tool that we use to extract the evidence off of the phones, Cellebrite.
I know where the state's information came from, which is a CD containing contents of Catherine Magdanova's iCloud from Cellebrite. Cellebrite report from Wendy Adelson's cell phone?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you download it?
Yes, ma'am.
How to refute an alibi using the mutual locations feature in Cellebrite Pathfinder. Digital data collected from a suspect can reveal significant information that can be valuable to criminal investigations. The Cellebrite Pathfinder digital analytics platform analyzes this data and provides the investigator with relevant leads that can shed light on the suspect's activity and verify their alibi. A core feature in Pathfinder is the ability to map out a suspect's geographic location and that of their accomplices whose devices were also seized. This combined data view is called mutual locations and can be a key factor in investigators' efforts to refute or corroborate an alibi. In this scenario, we will review data obtained from Ruth Langmore's mobile device. She is a known drug dealer in Washington. In this case, an agent at the local police department was informed about a drug deal that is about to happen. Subsequently, Ruth's house was raided and her phone lawfully seized. After uploading and analyzing the phone's data, more information was revealed. This additional evidence enabled the police to arrest 4 other gang members, whose devices we can now see on the left side of the initial dashboard screen in Pathfinder. In her statement, Ruth had previously denied ever having met the person of interest one more time. Since both are central to this case, we want to establish if her denial is legitimate or not. Let's see how the mutual locations feature within Pathfinder can assist us. First, let's open the Map View tab, which you can find in the upper toolbar, and then we'll navigate to the Faceted Filters pane on the left and select the owners we want to investigate. Let's select Juan and Ruth, then click Apply. If we scroll down the left sidebar, we can find and then select the Locations facet. This will allow us to see if there was any mutual activity occurring between Ruth and Juan in close proximity to each other. To do this, we will check the Show Activities with Location box, then select a proximity range within 100 feet of each other and a time range of 30 minutes, then click Apply. What we can now see on the map is whether a meeting between our persons of interest could have occurred. Here, we can see that there is a result from the mutual location search, shown by the square. To get more details, we can click on the little arrow on the right sidebar and expand the panel. The suspects are represented here by dots in different colors. Yellow is for Ruth, and green is for Juan. Now focus on the location point and zoom in. Here, we can see the 2 dots at the same location and time on the map. Both were at the Hyatt Regency Baltimore Hotel on the 8th of July. With this solid digital evidence, we can now tell detectives to look for security cameras to download footage that could show them together at the same time, and in this way, refute their previous alibis in which they claim to have never met before.
What is OkCupid?
OkCupid is a dating website.
Hi everyone, this is Heather Mahalik with another Tip Tuesday. This Tip Tuesday is going to be dedicated to Zach from Las Vegas PD. He was taking a training class and had a fantastic question. What do you do when you are looking at a forensic image and the person types a lot with emojis, or they receive a lot of messages with emojis? What is the best method for finding those, specifically if you have an emoji of interest that you want to search for? So I have several extractions loaded here. In the first one, you can see I searched for, it looks like a head of a person. I searched for a trophy in another. So I just want to show you how to do this. If you go up into the search window on the top right, and you press the Windows key and the period, just Windows dot or Windows period, you're going to see the emojis appear. So if you wanted to search for Santa Claus, you could click Santa Claus. But what you can also do is start typing your emoji that you want to find. So let's say you're looking for wink. And as you start typing, it is going to appear with the wink. And then you could click on it and show the winking face. So you're able to isolate with the words on how you would usually search for something, but you can also just click across the emojis. Once you have search results, you'll see that the results will be shown. Here you can see I searched for trophy, and you can see everywhere that there is a trophy. It is being shown in the chat information. You could search for anything you really want, but this is just a nice way for you to be able to isolate emojis in chats, because we know a lot of people use them, and we want to make your life a little bit easier here at Cellebrite.
OkCupid is a dating website.
Were you on that dating website?
I was.
Were you on that dating website at the time that you were dating Mr. Lacoste?
No, I wasn't.
And were you speaking, so I guess if you weren't on it, you weren't speaking to multiple men from the website during the time you were dating Mr. Lacoste. And I'll remind you that you provided your phone in this case, and it was Cellebrited.
How to refute a suspect's statement based on social media messaging applications. Social media is a great place to learn more about a suspect, their connections, and their habits. Let's see how we can use Pathfinder to discover the social circles and patterns of interactions of a suspect. Cellebrite Pathfinder displays a visual representation of networks, making it easier to find connections between parties, who the suspect may have interacted with, as well as potential middlemen connecting two parties of interest. The scenario. Ruth Langmore is a known drug dealer in Washington, and her cell phone was lawfully seized during a raid on her apartment. During the same raid, additional suspects were identified, but Ruth denied having any connection to them or that they had just met. Let's see how we learn more about Ruth Langmore and her acquaintances through her activity on social media. When reviewing the owner's dashboard, we can see from the most used chat platforms widget that social media serves as Ruth's primary communication platform. Now let's click on the graph view on the top menu bar. Next, we move to the faceted filters pane on the left. Select Ruth as the key owner and click Apply. Now let's click on the origin facet and select the relevant social media platforms. I'll select Facebook Messenger, TikTok, and Instagram, then click Apply. This will immediately display in a very visual way who the people are that the suspect is interacting with on the selected social media platforms. After clicking on her interaction with one of her contacts, Juan Moretime, we will open a new window on the right side of the screen. As we scroll down the conversation path, we see clearly that Ruth had several interactions on social media with Juan, and we also see an indication of a certain transaction of money that took place on the 10th of June. This easy and quick search in Pathfinder allows us to identify inconsistencies in Ruth's initial statement of a relationship with Juan, and also provides investigators with a potential lead regarding a transaction that took place between the two parties of interest.
Hi everyone, Heather Mahalik here with another Tip Tuesday. This week I want to bring Cellebrite Pathfinder back into the picture here, literally, and talk about image similarity. I've done a Tip Tuesday on this in the past, but this one's going to be slightly different. In this scenario, we have an image of a license plate that was part of a vehicle that was used by a gang as part of their drug dealing business. We want to be able to get the full license plate to make this vehicle suitable for forfeiture. So what we're going to do is we are going to look for similar images to see if we can actually get the full picture of what is happening in this scenario. Now, when we look here, you can see I am going to make sure I'm on the correct suspect or subject, go to gallery, and then search by image. And this is where you can choose a file. So if you have a file from another case that's relevant to your investigation, you can load it in the Pathfinder and search across many cases. Next, choose Load Similar Images. And as you start sorting through, you are going to see that we actually have a similar image that is relevant to this investigation. So now we can see the full license plate number. We can then possibly seize this vehicle or go search for it. But you can do this with many things. This is extremely important. And in terrorism, I've worked many investigations where license plates were found in pictures or found in dashboards. And it may be relevant to other pieces of media in your cases. So remember, you can do this cross case as well. You can load any image that you have as a piece of evidence into any case within Cellebrite Pathfinder.
Cellebrite's heroes behind the heroes. Our law enforcement heroes are ready to fight any evil. But when the fight turns to the digital arena, true heroes know who to root for. It's Daring DevOps. Getting to the office on time? No problem with his loyal scooter. Witness as he uncovers digital evidence using infrared rays. With the knowledge of AWS and Docker, Daring DevOps helps crack the toughest cases. It's in our hands now, Daring DevOps. Cellebrite, a global leader in digital intelligence solutions, invites you to become one of the heroes behind the heroes. Join Cellebrite and assist law enforcement everywhere in making the world a safer place. Fighting crime is for adults only. Sidekicks sold separately. Apply now.
Hello and welcome. In another segment, I talked about the sharing capabilities within Guardian. Now I'm going to dive into what we can do with Cellebrite UFDRs that require review. Guardian's integrated cloud review capabilities enable an investigation stakeholders to see the most common data types critical to any investigation. It's important to note here that the examiner has flagged this UFDR for suspected CSAM. That provides important information for me to handle this digital evidence accordingly. With the click of a button, I can begin my review of extracted digital intelligence. I can review extraction summary details, chats, media, call logs, browsing history, contacts, and now location data. Visualizing location information can easily provide the evidence you need to make the case. Guardian includes interactive map data while also allowing you to see whether a particular location has been visited. You can even limit your review to specific apps and obtain reverse lookup address information based on the geographic coordinates. Location data is the newest addition to Guardian's review capabilities, and you can expect to see even more features in the future. You might be wondering what type of data is in chats. Is it just SMS? Actually, no. Chats is an aggregate of both native SMS, MMS messages and third-party chat applications. The substance of the conversation is often far more important than the specific application. I can perform searches, filter by date, and review tags applied by the examiner within Physical Analyzer. Media includes images, videos, and audio, while also making use of the Physical Analyzer media categories for filtering. The rest of the views are just as intuitive. One thing you'll hear me say frequently is that if all I know about smartphones is that I have one and I know how to use my own, I already know enough to review extractions in Guardian. When we think about the hassles involved in copying flash media and physical transport, then add in frustrations trying to load large files on yesterday's computers, web review of digital intelligence within Guardian just makes sense. All of an investigation's stakeholders are in one place, easily reviewing the single source of truth. Thanks for joining.
Hello and welcome to our next episode of Modernizing Investigations. Why digital intelligence is important to the prosecutor and why that importance is increasing. I'm Matt Geckel. I'm a solutions engineer with Cellebrite. Prior to joining Cellebrite, I spent about 18 years in law enforcement, worked all manner of cases, and ended in the digital forensics lab, where I worked for about 10 years. With me today is our special guest, Brian Kramer, and I'm going to let him introduce himself. Brian.
Well, good morning, Matt. I'm Brian Kramer. I'm the state attorney for the 8th Judicial Circuit of Florida, which is in north central Florida, covering 6 counties that include Alachua, Union, Baker, Bradford, Levy, and Gilchrist County. Approximately 300,000 people that I represent, and I prosecute cases on behalf of the state of Florida. I've been a prosecutor for about 23 years and admitted to the bar for about 27 years. And in my role as prosecutor, I'm the chief law enforcement officer for the 8th Judicial Circuit of the state of Florida. And we prosecute in my office approximately 20,000 criminal cases per year.
Wow.
We have 45 assistant state attorneys who handle those 20,000 cases. We also have approximately 80 non-lawyer support staff who handle a variety of functions within the office to keep the office rolling, get the cases up and ready for trial. And we also work in a relationship with the University of Florida and other educational institutions and use approximately 15 to 20 interns per year to also assist in that prosecution. Yeah, and that's what we do.
Thank you. Obviously a very busy office.
Yes.
I'm particularly excited to have you here today as our liaison, as our resource for this episode as it relates to prosecution, because no one out there knows that, but you and I worked together for a long time, over 10 years now, when I was a detective and a forensic investigator, a digital forensic investigator, and we've together, aside from the many trials that you've done, you and I have had many trials together and had the opportunity to put a lot of bad guys away, make a lot of victims whole. So I'm very excited to have you here today.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
All right, so the reason we're here today, something to think about, to talk about, is very few cases in the past, right? Thinking, early 2000s, relied on digital data. And then even into the early, up into the 2010s, 11s, very few cases had mobile data. I would argue that today, now the exception for a case is that it actually doesn't have mobile data or any kind of digital evidence. We do an industry benchmark report every year where we reach out to our customers, members of the forensic community, and try to understand what they're seeing and where they're at. And what we've seen is that in cases where digital evidence is present, about 96% of those cases have a cell phone as some aspect, whether it's the defendants, the victims, or witnesses that are taking video and things like that. So now that this is part of an everyday life, for people, it's becoming more and more integral in the life of the criminal as well. And I think that's where we can kind of kick off and start talking about how digital evidence relates to, not only the criminal or the criminal aspect of the investigation, but how we can work as law enforcement with prosecutors to help kind of close what we're seeing as a gap, right? And the need for law enforcement agencies to modernize what they're doing, because, knocking on doors is good and all, but it's becoming, in my opinion, more of a back burner type of part of the investigation versus, going into the digital evidence and understanding and being able to help, shore up your cases and find your information that you need there.
Yeah. So, Matt, let me give you a historical view from my perspective of digital evidence through my career. I started in 1993 as a prosecutor, as an assistant public defender, and I moved quickly into prosecution around 1995. And in those days, there was literally nothing. The cameras were film. If someone did have a cell phone, no one knew what a smartphone was, so
Right.
There was nothing of that nature in that time. So as prosecution progressed through that time period, it was a very sort of slow roll into starting to see digital evidence coming into criminal cases. Mm-hmm. And as time went on, what really started at first was this concept that digital evidence reliable, right? Can we in the courtroom rely upon what's coming from what was then digital? The first camera phones was what the first sort of things that were happening. Was that reliable evidence? And of course, through time, we've seen that evolution move to all kinds of digital evidence that's coming from camera phones, then from smartphones, and from now portable devices of all different shapes and sizes, and then moving on to all kinds of video surveillance and things of that nature. And really, the evolution has come all the way around to where we started from at the beginning of my career of, can we possibly trust this information, to could we now possibly have a case where we don't have digital evidence? Could we convince a jury at this point in my prosecutorial career of a fact, of a prove a crime to a jury and tell them we don't have any digital evidence? It would be extremely challenging now. And as you pointed out, something like 96% of cases have digital evidence in them, and that, I would argue, is even probably low, because that represents a number where the digital evidence is of some useful value to the case, right? But if you're looking at any situation that law enforcement confronts now, there's always some form of digital media or digital information that's going to be present in that scene, in that situation. The only question is whether it is going to speak to whether or not the crime was committed, or whether that we can use it to prove that crime. So it is now 100% ubiquitous across all criminal cases, really.
Yeah, I remember getting phone calls from you or your office on a crime of any level of significance. What do you mean there's no phone? What do you mean we don't have phone records at a minimum? How is this possible? So it definitely has been a shift, and that we're talking 3 to 10 years ago, as opposed to now where it's even bigger. So one of the things that we talk about at Cellebrite is being that kind of end-to-end partner for investigations. And so at one end we have the crime occurring, right? And then at the other end is the successful prosecution of that crime and of that defendant. And that's something I think that doesn't always get talked about or thought about enough until we get into close to that end. And whereas it's something that we really need to be thinking about from the beginning, as soon as we can. And I know in certain cases, especially with your office, if it is a significant enough incident, or I would say, even not necessarily what the general public might consider to be significant, but something as simple as a homicide or just a shooting, you'll send a prosecutor out to the scene to work with law enforcement from the very beginning. And so today, that's what we're going to talk about, is really, in talking about this episode and coming up here, we've agreed that there's really kind of, from a prosecutorial point of view, 3 phases of the investigation. The first phase being the investigative with law enforcement phase, right? So from the beginning of the crime occurring, whether you send someone on scene, or if it's a long, protracted type of investigation where law enforcement investigators are looking into a particular person or trying to investigate a crime, to where your people, as prosecutors in your office, will get involved, whether it's subpoenas and search warrants, ensuring that what we're doing, is proper, or that we're being, sometimes you guys have other ideas and other avenues of investigations that you may be able to suggest to us, additional tools, if you will. So that initial phase, right, with law enforcement investigating, which then transitions into an investigative phase with prosecution, which we'll talk about, or the investigative phase for the prosecution, and then ultimately what we would call the prosecution or the trial phase of the case. That part where you have to take over now and you have to put on a show, right? You're taking this to trial and you have to explain to people, the general public, right, presumably, who have no background in this and no background in any kind of criminal law or anything, why this person did what it is that you say they did. So to get into that, we'll start with the investigative with law enforcement phase. Can you kind of explain
Sure.
from your perspective what that is?
Right. So in Florida and in most jurisdictions, there's a distinction between the prosecutor's office and law enforcement, that the investigators don't work for the prosecutor, they work for an independent and separate law enforcement agency. Mm-hmm. So there are exceptions to that in certain states, but certainly Florida is a state of that nature. So when there is a crime, and it doesn't really matter whether it's a minor crime or a major crime, the that first phase of that case is going to be with the investigative agency. And more serious crimes often warrant more involvement from the prosecutor because of the legal complexities associated with obtaining search warrants, subpoenas, and working with the courts and with legal departments of entities such as Facebook, Instagram, or Meta to obtain data on behalf of law enforcement. Many law enforcement agencies don't have their own legal counsel that would perform those functions for them.
Sure.
So in the initial phases of an investigation, one of the roles of the prosecutor is to work with the agency to serve in sort of that legal liaison function, where we are standing ready to work with them to issue search warrants where necessary to obtain data. We are working with them to issue subpoenas when that's legally appropriate to obtain the data that's available by subpoena, and also to work with them to advise them about what is necessary in order for the data that they're collecting or the digital forensic evidence that they're collecting to be admissible in the later proceedings of a case. And this is also true with any other form of evidence, but it can be especially legally difficult with digital forensic evidence because digital forensic evidence is an area of evolving law that is being regularly ruled on by the courts and is tending towards more rigorous scrutiny for privacy interests by the court. So one of our major roles in the beginning of the investigation is to serve that function. And of course, advising law enforcement of the sufficiency of whether the evidence is sufficient to come into court, but also is it going to be sufficient to prove the charges that they're contemplating. And also we serve in other roles, such as to advise law enforcement of what charges might be appropriate given the set of facts that are existent, and also to speak to issues such as what prosecutor may be appropriate. So there may be federal offenses and state offenses, or some jurisdictions will have prosecutors who work at different levels of the court system, so advising as to where the case might go for prosecution. That's sort of our very first initial phase of assisting law enforcement.
Okay, so that's fantastic, and what I'm hearing is kind of a scenario of you guys almost in real time working with law enforcement, and like you said, just making sure that what law enforcement is doing is ultimately not going to get thrown out, which I've personally seen,
Sure.
Due to overly broad search warrants and things like that. So having you guys there to review the work that we're doing, because we in law enforcement, we didn't go to law school, right? You know the intricacies of that part. We don't.
But also it's not just to keep something from getting thrown out. It's to make sure that what is collected and what is preserved is sufficient to establish the predicates that are necessary to prove admissibility.
Right.
That's not really the role of a law enforcement officer. They aren't trained in the rules of evidence.
Okay.
And so advising to say, hey, I understand that you've obtained this piece of evidence, but we're also going to need these foundational pieces in order to make that evidence admissible in a courtroom. That's one of the fundamental roles that the prosecutor plays in working with law enforcement in the initial phases of an investigation.
Very good. I want to go back to something you mentioned about the courts becoming more stringent and more privacy focused on
Sure.
what we can search, and just to put it in perspective, when I started in forensics, if we had that nexus to the cell phone and we had the right to search it, there was search incident to arrest, which we would just, if they was on their person, we would search it. That's no longer allowed. Or, hey, we want to search this cell phone and we want to look at everything. And where they've really tightened it down to where you have to specifically explain what it is you're looking for on that phone, why you're looking for it, and limiting yourself to a time period. And one of the ways that I used to explain it when I would teach digital forensics is that really the Supreme Court has basically said that a person's cell phone and right to privacy is just about the same as it is to the right to privacy inside their house. Would you tend to agree with that as the best way to really kind of look at?
Yeah, I think the best way to understand what happens with privacy as it relates to the courts is that privacy is not a static concept, and it is an evolving concept, and that privacy is based upon what society's expectations are for being able to live your life free of governmental intrusion.
Sure.
Right? So what the court is doing is they're looking at how much information does a particular thing reveal about an individual, and is society willing to say that that piece of information deserves a high level of protection? How intimately associated is that piece of information with our lives, right? So an example that is not really digital forensic data is that there was a point in the past where law enforcement was allowed to use heat sensing technology in order to obtain warrants to find grow houses.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, the Supreme Court said, this technology of sensing heat is so intrusive that we're going to require a warrant, right? Because it tells so much about what is going on in the privacy of someone's home that society recognizes that is something that the court should protect.
Right.
And so you take that principle, move it forward 20 years, and start looking at digital forensic evidence, and you have to ask yourself the question, how much does this piece of evidence that we're looking at reveal about this person's life? And what we know from looking at hundreds of phones over years of prosecution is that essentially it's telling us everything about this individual, right? We know who their family is. We now know where they're going. We know where they're shopping. We know what they're buying, right? We know what the car they drive. We know what kind of devices they have. We know what they're looking at on the internet. It goes on and on and on, and it is getting into the most private details of someone's life.
Right.
And so the evolution is that the courts tend to always be behind technology, right? The courts are catching up and realizing that the vast majority of society now has digital devices. The vast majority of society wants to have their information protected. And so the society is recognizing, and now the courts are recognizing, that there is a privacy interest in the content of the phone or any digital device, and are starting to heighten those privacy requirements. So if we look at privacy requirements, we have essentially none. Then we move to a subpoena, which all a subpoena requires for me is relevance. All I have to be able to prove to the world is that the subpoena will render, or is likely to render, relevant evidence in a criminal prosecution.
Right.
And then on from there, we move to search warrants, right? And a search warrant requires that there's probable cause to believe that the evidence of a crime will be located within the device or the thing that we're looking for, right? That's the highest level of scrutiny. And of course, we've always had the concept that warrants have to be limited in the scope of what they're looking for, and that they have to essentially use the least intrusive means. They teach you in law school that if your search warrant says that you're looking for an elephant, you cannot look in a kitchen drawer, right? And the same principle is now being applied to cell phones or to digital devices, where we can't really use elephants in kitchen drawers anymore because that doesn't work, right? But what the court can say is, if Matt Geckel is looking for a text message, then we cannot have Matt Geckel looking through photographs, right? Those are now our kitchen drawers that the courts once recognized. And that's really what we're starting to see, is that the courts are evolving in recognizing digital forensic evidence and what role it plays in the lives of our citizens.
Okay. So those are all very great points, and certainly there's so much more that could be covered there. There's almost an entire another episode. One thing that I did hear you talk about is just how ubiquitous cell phones are in our lives now, and how everything is on them, and people rarely want to be separated from them. And I think, it's something that we'll certainly talk about later, but what's your What you're referring to is what us in the industry, we call it the pattern of life, right? Is the ability for us to, at the end of the day, really figure out exactly everything about a person's life if we wanted to, based on the content on their cell phone, which could ultimately lead in the prosecution phase, right, to proving that that person had the cell phone on them at the time of the crime, or something to that effect. So really nice, really good stuff to bring up there. Thank you for that. We covered the investigative with law enforcement phase, right, working directly with the investigators as a prosecutor to help ensure that what they're doing is proper and admissible. From there, we move into what you refer to as the investigative for prosecution phase. So how do we get to that? What causes that transition from law enforcement to prosecution being the leader in the investigation?
Right. So the second phase of a prosecution really begins with the development of probable cause and law enforcement's decision to either make a custody arrest, which is what they would normally do if they have the individual.
Like putting a person in jail.
Take them to jail, and that starts a lot of the legal processes for the prosecutor. Speedy trial begins to run at that point, those type of things. Or, in the alternative, they're completing an affidavit of probable cause and making a warrant request. It's referred to in different ways in different jurisdictions, but it's essentially a warrant request to the prosecutor, or in some jurisdictions the warrant request might go directly to the court. But either way, these are really what would normally trigger sort of the second phase, which is that in general, law enforcement is responsible from nothing to probable cause, and the prosecutor's office is responsible from probable cause to proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And that is really where the second phase lies, is how do we get from probable cause, which is the standard to file a criminal charge, to proof beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the standard to win a criminal jury trial, right? And somewhere in between there is the standard of when do we file a criminal charge, right? So we don't know for sure whether there's proof beyond a reasonable doubt, because that's up to a jury to decide. But what we do know is it's something more than probable cause that we have to have before we file a criminal charge. And that's where the prosecution investigative phase begins and essentially ends.
In Pathfinder, we have the ability to display visual representation of communications, making it easier to find connections between parties who the suspect may interact with, or even the potential middleman connecting two parties of interest by plotting social circles. The easiest way to plot these social circles is to start with the top interactive parties in the dashboard. So when we're in dashboard view, we can click on Go, and that is going to lead us to the top interactive parties widget, where we can review the owner's main connections and the number of interactions they had with one another. When in the chats view, you will see that there's a thread of chats between the owner of the party you choose. In this case, we see Juan and Renee. You can either look at the group chat that they both take part in, or in their peer-to-peer chats. The choice is yours. If we click back, we're going to be able to see another useful feature, which is the most interactive platforms. Within the most interactive platforms, we see that criminals tend to use multiple chat platforms in order to possibly hide their communications from law enforcement, or because they're simply encrypted and they think it's a more secure way to communicate. When you hover on each participant, you can see the breakdown of the channels. In this case, what we're looking at is Renee. The graph view. The graph view is a great way for you to identify mutual connections and potential middlemen, as mentioned earlier. We want to be able to find the most important or useful people within an investigation. So what you can look at here is interaction frequency. We can navigate the graph and we can filter on this in the graph settings to select a minimum or maximum number of an event. So you can set an amount, and then you can change that to see the different correlation. This is a way that we can filter out people who are not as relevant to the investigation. When you click on the link to investigate, this is how you're going to actually see these mutual connections. Here we can see the mutual connections between Tony, Renee, and Ruth. So you can see the different colorization that helps it stand out for who these people have in common. High-level criminals will often avoid interacting directly with lower-level associates in order to separate themselves. So it's important that we understand the compartmentalization here. So here we can see Renee and agency Danny. We can also see, if you go into event type, we can choose the number of participants. And do we want it to be greater than, less than, or equal to? So here I'm going to say greater than 3 and search. And it's going to narrow and change that view for you. And you're going to see additional people at this point. So now we can see we have Dan Juris, we have Tony, Renee, Ruth, and Juan. The choice is yours in what you can do in analyzing these groups. It's important that you focus on larger groups or smaller intimate ones. For the large groups, you can figure out potential upcoming gatherings, but for these small ones, you may actually be able to see the true point of communications.
Signal I love this. Moxie Marlinspike, I love you, Moxie Marlinspike. He says he got a hold of the Cellebrite phone cracking tool and he hacked it. And it turns out, according to Moxie Marlinspike, Cellebrite software, this is the device that law enforcement buys at great expense so that they can suck the data out of your phone. Border Patrol has it, lots of people have it. Moxie says this software has atrocious security that can easily be manipulated in a variety of terrifying ways. We were surprised, he writes, to find that very little care seems to have been given to Cellebrite's own software security. Industry standard exploit mitigation defenses are missing, and many opportunities for exploitation are present. Until Cellebrite is able to accurately repair all vulnerabilities in its software with high confidence, the only remedy a Cellebrite user has is not to scan devices,